You think Depression-era families skipped Christmas dinner when money ran out? Think again. American kitchens from 1929 through the early 1940s created some of the most resourceful holiday meals ever made from almost nothing. Let's dig into 30 cheap Christmas meals poor families made during the Great Depression. Mock apple pie was the miracle dessert that fooled everyone at the Christmas table, made entirely without a single apple in sight. When fresh fruit became a luxury most families could not afford, clever cooks discovered that Ritz crackers soaked in a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and lemon juice transformed into something tasting remarkably like real apple pie. The crackers absorbed the spiced liquid, swelling and softening until they achieved the exact texture of cooked apples. Families baked these pies in cast-iron skillets, serving them warm with whatever cream the household could spare. Children often had no idea they were eating crackers instead of fruit, their faces lighting up at the familiar Christmas flavors of cinnamon and nutmeg. The recipe spread through church bulletins and word of mouth between neighbors sharing survival strategies. Mock apple pie represented Depression ingenuity, proving that holiday traditions could survive even when orchards were bare and grocery money had vanished. Potato soup became the warm embrace that greeted many families on Christmas morning when nothing else filled the pantry. Potatoes cost only pennies per pound even in the hardest years and could be stored in root cellars for months without spoiling. Mothers would dice whatever potatoes remained from fall harvest, simmering them slowly with onions in water or milk until the mixture thickened naturally into creamy filling soup. The aroma of simmering onions and tender potatoes filled small kitchens, creating warmth that went beyond temperature. Some families added bacon grease for richness, while others stretched the soup by crumbling day-old bread into each bowl. Children gathered around tables covered with oilcloth, hands wrapped around warm bowls that chased away December chill. Potato soup required no expensive ingredients, no special equipment, just patience and willingness to turn humble vegetables into something that tasted like love. It was Christmas dinner for those who had nothing else to serve. Bread pudding transformed stale loaves into Christmas dessert, rescuing what would otherwise become waste and turning it into celebration. Every crust, every heel, every slice gone too hard to eat was saved throughout December until Christmas Eve arrived. The dried bread was torn into chunks, soaked in whatever milk the family could afford, then mixed with eggs, sugar, and precious spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Baked until golden in cast-iron pans handed down through generations, the pudding emerged transformed from kitchen scraps into something resembling abundance. Families drizzled molasses or made simple sauces from butter and sugar to top their portions. The texture was both tender and substantial, the sweetness balanced by honest bread flavor. Bread pudding taught children that nothing should be thrown away, that creativity could rescue the humblest ingredients. This dessert carried Christmas forward when fancy cakes and store-bought sweets were impossible dreams for struggling households. Ham bone soup stretched a single Christmas ham into weeks of nourishment for families who could barely afford meat. When a family managed to purchase or barter for a ham during the holidays, nothing was discarded. The bone became foundation for soup that could feed everyone multiple times. The bone simmered for hours in large iron pots, releasing rich marrow and smoky flavor into broth, while dried beans softened alongside it. Root vegetables from the cellar, carrots, turnips, potatoes, joined the pot, creating a meal both hearty and affordable. Every bit of meat clinging to the bone was carefully scraped and returned to the soup. Families ladled steaming bowls of this broth throughout the week following Christmas, each serving a reminder of the holiday meal. Ham bone soup represented practical magic of Depression-era cooking, where one purchase became many meals. It was more than sustenance. It bridged holiday celebration and ordinary survival for families counting every penny. Molasses cookies were the sweet tradition that survived when sugar became too expensive for Christmas baking. Blackstrap molasses cost less than refined sugar and was available at every country store, giving these cookies their dark color and robust flavor. The dough was mixed by hand in wooden bowls, combining flour, lard, or bacon drippings, eggs, and generous molasses until it formed a sticky, fragrant mass. Ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were added when available, transforming simple ingredients into something that tasted like the holidays. Cookies baked on greased pans until edges crisped and centers stayed soft, filling kitchens with spiced aroma children would remember for decades. Mothers made batches large enough to share with neighbors and to leave out for relatives. The dark sweetness hit the tongue differently than sugar, deeper, almost earthy, with mineral notes that tasted like comfort. Molasses cookies proved Christmas could still taste special, even when pennies stretched impossibly far. Water pie was the desperate dessert that turned almost nothing into something sweet enough for Christmas dinner. When families could not afford eggs, milk, butter, or fruit, this pie emerged from sheer necessity and stubborn determination to have dessert on the holiday table. The filling was astonishingly simple: water, sugar, flour, vanilla, and small amount of butter mixed together and poured into a pie crust. During baking, the mixture transformed into custard-like filling that was surprisingly satisfying. The pie had other names in different regions: depression pie, desperation pie, names carrying the weight of era's hardship. Children eating this pie often never knew how little it contained, only that mother had made them Christmas dessert. The crust could be made from lard and flour, ingredients even the poorest pantries usually held. Water pie represented the absolute bottom of depression experience, yet also represented triumph, love and determination, creating celebration from virtually nothing at all. Stuffed cabbage rolls appeared on Christmas tables across immigrant communities, stretching small amounts of meat into dishes that fed entire families. The technique came from Eastern European traditions, adapted to Depression realities where ground meat was a luxury used sparingly. Cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around filling of rice, onion, and whatever meat scraps the family could afford. Sometimes just tablespoons stretched through an entire batch. The rolls simmered for hours in tomato sauce, the long cooking tenderizing everything and melding flavors together. By Christmas dinner, each roll became a complete package of protein, grain, and vegetable. The aroma of simmering cabbage and tomatoes filled homes, announcing to neighbors that holiday meal was being prepared. Stuffed cabbage taught the art of stretching resources without sacrificing satisfaction, connecting families to heritage while solving the problem of feeding many mouths with little money. Rice pudding with raisins turned leftover rice into Christmas dessert that felt far more special than ingredients suggested. When rice remained from previous meals, thrifty cooks transformed it by baking slowly with milk, eggs, sugar, and precious raisins saved for holiday baking. The pudding emerged from the oven golden and creamy, with plump raisins scattered throughout like treasure. Cinnamon and nutmeg added warmth that made the simple dish taste festive. Families served it warm or cold, sometimes with cream for those who could afford it. Children loved the sweetness and surprise of finding raisins in each bite, never realizing they were eating kitchen economy. The dish required no special equipment, just a baking dish and patience for slow cooking. Rice pudding represented the creative bridge between everyday leftovers and holiday celebration, proving that Christmas dessert did not require expensive ingredients, only knowledge of how to transform simple things into something worth remembering. Oatmeal pie emerged as the poor family's answer to pecan pie, substituting humble oats for nuts that had become impossibly expensive. The filling combined oats with corn syrup or molasses, eggs, butter, and vanilla, creating texture and sweetness remarkably similar to pecan pies wealthier families enjoyed. Baked until the top turned golden and slightly crunchy, while the interior stayed gooey, oatmeal pie delivered satisfaction exceeding its modest cost. The recipe spread through communities where pecan trees did not grow, and store-bought nuts were beyond family budgets. Women shared it at church gatherings, proud of solving the problem of making fancy pie without fancy ingredients. Children receiving a slice at Christmas dinner experienced the same joy as those eating the original. Oatmeal pie represented both practical necessity and culinary creativity, proving that substitution could produce something genuinely delicious and teaching families that holiday traditions could be maintained regardless of economic circumstances. Prune cake brought dense, moist sweetness to Christmas tables when other fruits were too expensive. Dried prunes were affordable, shelf-stable, and available year-round at general stores, making them reliable for families who could not afford fresh fruit or canned goods. The batter was enriched with stewed prunes chopped and folded throughout, along with spices like cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg that transformed simple ingredients into something festive. Baked in cast-iron pans, the cake emerged dark, fragrant, and moist in ways other Depression-era cakes rarely achieved. The prunes kept it from drying out, allowing it to be made ahead for Christmas Day. Some families added powdered sugar dustings while others served slices plain, letting fruit and spices speak for themselves. Prune cake was practical rather than glamorous, but it delivered real satisfaction to families who had learned that survival and celebration could coexist, each slice proving modest ingredients could still create holiday memories. Vinegar pie carried the tang of desperation transformed into something surprisingly delicious on Depression Christmas tables. When lemons were impossible to afford and fruit fillings remained a distant memory, families discovered that plain white vinegar could provide the tartness needed for a satisfying custard pie. The filling combined vinegar with sugar, eggs, butter, and flour, creating a custard that baked into something resembling lemon pie without the expense of citrus. The taste was sharp and sweet, with a silky texture that fooled many into thinking real fruit had been used. Mothers baked these pies in the same tins their grandmothers had used, continuing traditions even when ingredients changed. Children ate their slices without complaint, grateful for any dessert on the holiday table. The recipe required nothing beyond basic pantry staples, making it accessible to even the poorest households. Vinegar pie taught that substitution was not defeat, but creativity, proving Christmas dessert could survive any hardship. Cornmeal mush served as Christmas breakfast for countless families who had little else to start the holiday morning. Ground corn was the cheapest grain available during the Depression, costing mere pennies for enough to feed a family for days. The mush was made by slowly stirring cornmeal into boiling water, cooking it until the mixture thickened into a porridge that was both filling and warming. Served hot in deep bowls with molasses drizzled over the top, it provided the energy children needed before the excitement of whatever small Christmas celebrations awaited. Some families added a splash of milk when they could afford it, making the dish slightly richer and more satisfying. The texture was smooth and comforting, the corn flavor honest and familiar. Cornmeal mush represented the absolute basics of survival cooking, yet it carried warmth and nourishment that more expensive foods could not match. For families with nothing else, this simple porridge was Christmas morning itself. Hoover stew earned its bitter name from the president many blamed for the Depression, yet it fed families through Christmas when nothing else was available. The stew was made from whatever scraps remained in the pantry. Potatoes, onions, perhaps a bit of cabbage or turnip, all simmered together in water until soft. Meat was rare in these stews, but when available, even the smallest scraps of bacon or salt pork could transform the pot into something approaching a real meal. Families gathered around steaming bowls on Christmas Day, grateful for warmth and substance even if the ingredients were humble. The stew stretched to feed as many as needed, with extra water and vegetables added to accommodate unexpected guests. Children learned that Christmas dinner was not about fancy foods, but about family gathered together, sharing what little they had. Hoover stew carried resentment in its name, but love in its preparation, feeding millions through the darkest holiday seasons of the era. Fried cornmeal mush transformed breakfast leftovers into something resembling Christmas treat when sliced and crisped in hot fat. The mush from morning was poured into loaf pans and allowed to cool until firm enough to slice into thick rounds or rectangles. These slices were then fried in bacon grease, lard, or whatever cooking fat the family had saved, until the outsides turned golden and crispy while the insides stayed soft and warm. Served with molasses, sorghum syrup, or a sprinkle of precious sugar, the fried mush became something children actually looked forward to eating. The contrast between crunchy exterior and creamy interior made each bite interesting, a rare pleasure during times when most food was merely functional. Mothers appreciated that one batch of cornmeal could provide both breakfast and supper, stretching resources across multiple meals. Fried cornmeal mush proved that even the simplest ingredients could be elevated with technique, bringing small moments of joy to Depression-era holiday tables. Navy bean soup simmered on Christmas Eve in homes across America, filling kitchens with savory aroma that promised nourishment for the holiday. Dried navy beans were soaked overnight, then cooked slowly with whatever flavoring the family could afford. A ham bone saved from better times, a piece of salt pork, or simply onion and salt. The beans broke down into creamy richness during the long cooking, creating a soup that was both filling and satisfying. Families ladled it over cornbread or served it alongside biscuits made from flour and lard, creating complete meals from ingredients that cost almost nothing. The soup could feed a family for days, with leftovers reheated for Christmas dinner and the meals that followed. Children grew up associating the smell of simmering beans with holiday memories, not realizing until later how little their parents had spent. Navy bean soup was survival made delicious, proving that protein and comfort could come from the humblest sources. Cream-dried beef stretched a small amount of preserved meat into Christmas breakfast that felt almost luxurious during hard times. Dried beef, sold in small jars or packages at every general store, was one of the few meat products poor families could afford. The beef was torn into pieces and simmered in white sauce made from flour, butter, or bacon grease and milk, creating a savory gravy that was poured over toast or biscuits. The dish was salty and rich, with enough protein to sustain a family through Christmas morning activities. Some called it by its military nickname, but in family kitchens it was simply a way to make meat stretch further than it should. Children loved the creamy sauce and did not notice how little actual meat was present. The recipe required only pantry staples and a small investment in dried beef, making it accessible even in the worst years. Creamed dried beef turned scarcity into satisfaction, one ladleful at a time. Wild persimmon pudding brought free sweetness to Christmas tables in regions where these native fruits grew abundantly. Persimmons ripened after the first frost, falling from trees in quantities that anyone could gather without spending a penny. The soft, ripe fruit was mashed and strained to remove seeds, then mixed with flour, milk, eggs, and spices to create a dense, sweet pudding, unlike anything store-bought could match. Baked until set, the pudding had an almost caramel-like flavor, with hints of cinnamon and nutmeg that made it taste like Christmas itself. Families who knew where persimmon trees grew guarded this knowledge, returning each November to harvest fruit for the holiday season. Children helped gather the sticky fruits, learning early that nature provided its own gifts for those willing to look. Wild persimmon pudding represented the connection between land and table that sustained communities through the Depression, proving that Christmas abundance could come from the woods rather than the store. Milk toast offered comfort to families who had little more than bread and dairy for Christmas breakfast. Day-old bread was toasted until golden, then placed in bowls and covered with warm milk that had been sweetened slightly with sugar and perhaps flavored with a drop of vanilla. The toast softened in the milk, creating something between cereal and bread pudding that was both filling and soothing. For sick children or elderly family members, milk toast was especially valued as gentle nourishment that went down easily. The dish cost almost nothing, yet delivered warmth and sustenance that more expensive foods could not surpass. Families gathered around the table to eat their bowls of softened toast, grateful for milk when many had none. Milk toast was simple to the point of seeming too plain, yet it carried comfort that transcended its humble ingredients. It was Christmas breakfast for those who measured wealth in warmth rather than abundance. Cornbread dressing stretched a small amount of bread into the centerpiece of Depression-era Christmas dinner. Leftover cornbread was crumbled and mixed with sautéed onions, celery if available, sage, salt, and pepper, then moistened with broth or water and baked until golden on top. For families who could not afford turkey or ham, the dressing itself became the main dish, served in generous portions with gravy made from pan drippings or flour and water. The texture was both soft and slightly crispy where it touched the pan, the sage lending an herbal warmth that tasted like the holidays. Mothers made extra batches knowing the dressing would disappear quickly, with children asking for seconds before the meal was half finished. The recipe required nothing expensive, just cornmeal, eggs, and whatever aromatics the garden or pantry provided. Cornbread dressing proved that the spirit of Christmas dinner could survive even when the centerpiece meat could not. Boiled custard brought creamy richness to Christmas gatherings when families could not afford fancy desserts or store-bought treats. Milk was heated gently with sugar and vanilla, then thickened with beaten eggs that were stirred constantly to prevent curdling. The result was a smooth, pourable custard that could be served warm or chilled, spooned into cups as both drink and dessert. Making boiled custard required patience and attention. Too much heat, and the eggs would scramble, ruining the entire batch. Grandmothers passed down the technique to daughters who passed it to their own children, the recipe traveling through generations without ever being written down. The custard was rich enough to feel special, yet required only ingredients most kitchens already contained. Served alongside Christmas cookies or simply on its own, boiled custard represented the kind of homemade luxury that made holidays memorable. It proved that celebration did not require store-bought extravagance, only skill and care. Potato candy surprised children who never guessed that mashed potatoes could become Christmas confection. The recipe began with cold leftover mashed potatoes mixed with powdered sugar until a stiff, pliable dough formed. This dough was rolled flat, spread with peanut butter, then rolled into a log and sliced into pinwheels that looked almost professional. The candy was sweet and satisfying, with the potato providing body while remaining completely undetectable in the final product. Families made batches during Christmas week, storing slices in tins for when company arrived or children needed a treat. The cost was negligible. Potatoes were cheap, powdered sugar affordable, and peanut butter a pantry staple. Children helped with rolling and cutting, turning candy making into family activity. Potato candy proved that Depression ingenuity could transform unlikely ingredients into celebration, giving families homemade treats when store-bought candy remained beyond reach. Tomato soup cake emerged as one of the strangest yet most successful Depression-era Christmas creations. The recipe called for condensed tomato soup mixed into spice cake batter, where the soup added moisture, subtle tang, and rich color without any tomato flavor surviving the baking. The result was dense, moist cake with warm spices that tasted like traditional holiday baking despite its unusual secret ingredient. Families who could not afford butter, eggs, or milk found that tomato soup provided the fat and liquid necessary for success. The cake was often frosted with cream cheese icing when available, or dusted with powdered sugar for simpler presentation. Children eating this cake never suspected its contents, only knowing that mother had produced Christmas dessert from a bare pantry. Tomato soup cake represented creative desperation, proving that unconventional thinking could solve the problem of holiday baking when conventional ingredients were impossible to afford. Sorghum cake brought deep, complex sweetness to Christmas tables in regions where sorghum syrup was cheaper than sugar or molasses. The thick amber syrup, pressed from sorghum cane grown on small farms throughout the South and Midwest, gave cakes a distinctive flavor that was both earthy and sweet. Bakers substituted sorghum for sugar and molasses in traditional recipes, adjusting flour and spices to accommodate the syrup's unique properties. The cakes emerged dark and moist, with a flavor that reminded families of autumn harvests and the hard work that produced their sweetener. Sorghum was often bartered or homemade, costing families nothing but labor when money had disappeared entirely. Children grew up associating this particular sweetness with Christmas, never realizing their holiday cake was born from economic necessity rather than culinary choice. Sorghum cake connected celebration to the land, proving that regional ingredients could create traditions as meaningful as any store-bought luxury. Scripture cake required families to look up Bible verses to find each ingredient, turning Christmas baking into religious education and family activity. The recipe listed ingredients by scriptural reference: Judges for honey, Leviticus for salt, Jeremiah for figs, requiring children to search family Bibles before measuring could begin. This format made cake baking an afternoon project that kept children occupied while teaching them to navigate scripture. The resulting cake was dense fruit cake filled with figs, raisins, honey, and spices, traditional Christmas flavors assembled through faithful searching. Families with little money for entertainment found that scripture cake provided both dessert and activity, stretching resources across multiple needs. The recipe appeared in church bulletins throughout the Depression, spreading from congregation to congregation. Scripture cake represented the intersection of faith and survival that characterized many Depression families, proving celebration could nourish both body and spirit. Crackling bread added precious protein to Christmas dinner when meat was too expensive for most families. Cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering pork fat into lard, were stirred into cornbread batter before baking, distributing small nuggets of porky richness throughout. The cracklings had been saved from fall hog butchering, stored carefully for months until they could elevate holiday meals. Each bite delivered corn sweetness interrupted by salty, savory crunch that made simple bread feel substantial. Families who raised hogs considered cracklings precious, using them sparingly to make special occasions feel different from ordinary days. The bread baked in cast-iron skillets preheated until smoking, creating crispy crust that shattered against teeth. Crackling bread represented nose-to-tail philosophy that sustained rural families, wasting nothing from animals that cost so much to raise. It transformed Christmas dinner from survival into something approaching feast. Gingerbread with hard sauce became Christmas dessert for families who could afford molasses but little else for holiday baking. The cake was dark and dense, spiced with ginger, cinnamon, and cloves that filled kitchens with the scent of the season. Baked in square pans and cut into portions, the gingerbread was served warm with hard sauce, butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla beaten until fluffy. The sauce melted into warm cake, creating richness that made humble dessert feel indulgent. Molasses provided sweetness and moisture at a fraction of sugar's cost, while spices were used sparingly enough to last through multiple seasons. Children watched hard sauce being made, waiting to lick the spoon before it reached the table. Gingerbread with hard sauce proved that Christmas tradition did not require expensive ingredients, only knowledge of how to coax celebration from a nearly empty pantry. Apple butter stack cake towered on Christmas tables throughout Appalachia, built from thin cake layers spread with homemade apple butter. Each layer was baked separately, thin and slightly dry, designed to absorb moisture from the fruit spread stacked between them. The apple butter had been made in fall, cooked in copper kettles over outdoor fires until apples transformed into thick, spiced paste. Assembling the cake was often community effort, with neighbors each contributing a layer to build towers reaching 6 or 8 layers high. The finished cake needed to rest for days, allowing apple butter to soften layers until they could be cut cleanly. The flavor was concentrated apple and warm spices, with texture falling somewhere between cake and fruit leather. Apple butter stack cake represented the connection between seasons, using fall's harvest to create Christmas celebration through patience and community cooperation. Peanut soup appeared on Christmas tables in southern states where peanuts grew abundantly and cost almost nothing for farming families. Roasted peanuts were ground into paste, then simmered with onion, celery, and chicken broth until the mixture became creamy and rich. The soup had African roots, brought to America and adapted over generations into something uniquely Southern. Served hot in cups or bowls, it provided protein and warmth that more expensive soups could not match. Families who grew their own peanuts could make this soup without spending money, transforming their cash crop into Christmas dinner. The flavor was nutty and savory, surprisingly sophisticated for such humble ingredients. Children often helped shell peanuts for the soup, turning preparation into family activity and Christmas memory. Peanut soup proved that regional abundance could create holiday traditions as meaningful as any expensive import. Sweet pudding steamed for hours on Christmas Day, filling homes with rich aroma of holiday tradition carried forward from English ancestors. Sweet, hard fat surrounding beef kidneys, was grated and mixed with flour, breadcrumbs, dried fruit, and spices to create dense pudding tied in cloth and boiled for hours. The fat melted during cooking, creating richness that kept the pudding moist and satisfying. Families who could not afford butter found that sweat from local butchers cost almost nothing, since most customers considered it waste. The finished pudding was dense and dark, served with hard sauce or simple syrup poured over the top. Making it required patience, with long cooking turning Christmas morning into vigil around the stove. Sweat pudding connected Depression families to older traditions, proving ancestors had also celebrated with humble ingredients transformed through skill into something worth remembering. Popcorn balls became Christmas candy that cost almost nothing, yet delivered joy to children throughout the Depression. Popcorn was popped in kettles over wood stoves, then drizzled with molasses or corn syrup boiled to the right consistency for binding. Working quickly before syrup cooled, mothers shaped handfuls of the sticky mixture into balls that hardened into treats both crunchy and sweet. The popcorn was often homegrown, the syrup affordable even in the worst years, making these treats accessible to nearly every family. Children helped shape balls, hands buttered to prevent sticking, turning candy making into Christmas memory. Treats were wrapped in waxed paper for Christmas morning, appearing in stockings beside small gifts. Popcorn balls represented simple ingredients transformed through timing and technique into something children treasured, proving Christmas magic did not require store-bought candy. Crackling cornbread emerged from cast-iron skillets at Christmas dinners, where wheat flour was too expensive and leftover pork scraps needed purpose. The cracklings, crispy bits of rendered pork fat and skin, were folded into cornmeal batter, adding richness and texture that transformed simple bread into something special. The batter was poured into a skillet greased with lard and preheated until smoking, creating a crust that shattered when cut. Inside, the cornbread stayed moist and tender, studded with salty, chewy cracklings that delivered bursts of pork flavor in every bite. The bread accompanied whatever else appeared on the table, soaking up gravies and pot liquors that might otherwise go to waste. Making crackling cornbread used every part of the hog, wasting nothing in kitchens where waste was unthinkable. Children fought over the corner pieces with the most crust. Crackling cornbread represented ingenuity, the transformation of scraps into something eagerly anticipated. Cream cheese mints were the soft pastel candies that looked like tiny ornaments on Christmas tables. Made from cream cheese, powdered sugar, and peppermint, they were both refreshing and sweet, like winter air wrapped in sugar. Children scooped the dough into small balls, pressed them into little molds, and dusted them with sugar. Each mint came out with delicate patterns shaped like bells or trees. They dried just enough to form a light shell while staying soft inside. These mints showed up at gatherings, weddings, church socials, and anywhere a pretty candy was needed. They were simple, cheap, and festive. Over time, the tradition faded, but older generations remember them as a symbol of homemade hospitality. They tasted like nostalgia in pastel form. Oxtail stew simmered for hours on Christmas Eve, transforming the cheapest cuts from the butcher into rich, gelatinous luxury that rivaled any expensive roast. Butchers practically gave away oxtails, considering them scraps fit only for those who couldn't afford better. But patient cooks knew the secret. Those bony sections contained collagen that melted into silky richness when braised low and slow. The tails were browned in batches, then returned to heavy pots with onions, carrots, turnips, and whatever root vegetables the cellar still held. Hours of gentle simmering transformed tough meat into fork-tender strands, surrounded by gravy thick enough to coat a spoon. The marrow melted into the liquid, adding depth that no other cut could provide. Families gathered around steaming bowls, using bread to capture every drop. Oxtail stew represented the wisdom of slow cooking, the understanding that time and heat could elevate even the humblest ingredients. Lady Baltimore cake towered over Southern Christmas tables in layers of white perfection filled with fruits and nuts. This elegant creation featured white cake layers filled with a mixture of raisins, figs, pecans, and sometimes candied cherries, all bound with fluffy white frosting. The cake originated in Charleston and spread throughout the South as the pinnacle of holiday baking. Each layer required careful handling, the delicate crumb demanding gentle assembly. The filling combined textures, chewy dried fruit, crunchy nuts, smooth frosting, into something complex and satisfying. Families reserved Lady Baltimore for Christmas Day dinner, when its impressive height could be properly appreciated. Making the frosting required cooking sugar syrup to precise temperature before beating it into egg whites until glossy. The cake improved overnight as flavors melded and moisture distributed evenly. Lady Baltimore represented the apex of Southern hospitality, a dessert that announced celebration through both beauty and taste. Shoofly pie was a slice of Appalachian history wrapped in a layer of sticky molasses and crumb topping, a dessert born from frugality and resourcefulness. It was called shoofly because the sweet smell drew flies toward the table and cooks had to shoo them away as the pie cooled. Families made it because molasses was cheaper and easier to store than sugar, making it the perfect holiday ingredient for households that had more hard work than money. The pie baked into a deep, gooey layer at the bottom with a crumbly cake-like topping on top, creating a texture that felt both rustic and indulgent. Children loved it because it was sweet enough to feel forbidden, and adults enjoyed it because every bite tasted like the land they came from. Over time, as refined sugar became cheap and store-bought pies took over, shoofly pie disappeared from most homes. It was too regional, too old-fashioned, too simple to compete with newer holiday desserts, but the people who remember it still talk about it with a quiet pride. It was a dessert that told a story, and every slice tasted a little like history. Keeping the house warm and cozy on Thanksgiving was something Grandma did without even thinking, turning the entire home into a place that felt safe and soft. The oven warmed the kitchen, blankets lay folded on chairs, and the lighting glowed low and gentle instead of bright and harsh. Even before the food came out, the house felt like a refuge from the cold outside. People walked in and immediately relaxed, their shoulders dropping as the warmth wrapped around them. The smell of roasting turkey mixed with the faint scent of cinnamon or something sweet she always had sitting on the back burner. The windows fogged slightly from the heat, making the outside world feel far away. Grandma knew comfort was part of the meal, part of the celebration, part of what made Thanksgiving feel complete. She created that warmth as naturally as she breathed. Chocolate-covered potato chips were a sweet and salty secret tradition in many Midwest homes. Before snack companies copied the idea, families dipped sturdy potato chips into melted chocolate right in their own kitchens. The hardest part was choosing chips thick enough to survive the dip. Someone melted chocolate on the stove, while others sorted through the pile, picking the best ones. The mix of salty crunch and sweet chocolate was addictive and felt almost mischievous. These treats appeared at Christmas parties when families wanted something fun and unexpected. They were quick, imperfect, and made with laughter. Over time, companies sold their own versions, but the homemade ones had a charm machines could not mimic. They tasted like joy with a hint of rebellion. Let's dig into 30 lost Christmas desserts America completely forgot. Fruitcake with suet was once the undisputed king of Christmas desserts, baked weeks in advance and aged like fine wine in American pantries. The recipe called for beef suet, hard fat from around the kidneys, which gave the cake an incomparably moist texture that butter could not replicate. Dried fruits were soaked in brandy for days before being folded into dense batter, heavy with molasses and spices. The cakes were wrapped in cheesecloth soaked in spirits and stored in cool cellars, developing deeper flavor each week. Families served thin slices alongside coffee after Christmas dinner, the richness demanding moderation. The suet kept the cake fresh for months, practical for households without reliable refrigeration. Children wrinkled their noses at the dense texture, but adults understood this was celebration food meant to last. Today, fruitcake survives mostly as a punchline, but the suet-laden original was magnificent. Vinegar pie filled the dessert spot on Christmas tables when eggs were scarce and lemons impossibly expensive, its tangy sweetness fooling children who never suspected the humble ingredient list. The filling required only sugar, flour, butter, water, and a splash of vinegar that provided the tartness usually contributed by citrus. Cooked slowly until thickened, the mixture was poured into pastry shells and baked until set, emerging with a custardy texture that rivaled proper lemon pie. The vinegar's sharpness mellowed during baking, leaving only pleasant tang that balanced the sweetness. Mothers guarded the recipe's secret, knowing children would reject dessert made with vinegar if they knew. The pie cost mere pennies, yet delivered satisfaction equal to fancy bakery creations. Vinegar pie represented Depression-era ingenuity, proof that chemistry and creativity could overcome poverty's limitations. Families served it proudly, creating Christmas memories that had nothing to do with expensive ingredients. Apple pandowdy was the rustic cousin of all the fancier apple desserts, a dish that did not care about looks or presentation and still managed to win every heart at the table. It began with sliced apples simmered with cinnamon, butter, and a touch of brown sugar until the whole house smelled like the inside of an orchard. Instead of laying a perfect crust over the top, cooks would break pieces of dough and scatter them unevenly, letting the edges sink into the bubbling fruit as it baked. The juices caramelized around the dough, turning each little piece into something crisp, chewy, and irresistible. This was a dessert for families who valued flavor over perfection, people who understood that the best dishes are sometimes the messiest. Children loved it because it felt fun, like a dessert that broke the rules, and adults loved it because it tasted like the orchard harvest served straight from the pan. But as crisps and cobblers became more popular and easier to sell in bakeries, the pandowdy quietly slipped away. Its uneven top was not camera-ready, and its old-fashioned name did not help it survive in a modern world. Still, anyone who ever ate it fresh from the oven remembers the way it tasted like fall itself, a forgotten treasure hiding in plain sight. Listening to holiday music while she cooked was one of Grandma's ways of setting the tone for the entire house. She would put on a record or turn the radio to the seasonal station, letting songs drift through the rooms as she stirred, chopped, and baked. The melodies blended with the sounds of pots simmering, the oven door opening, and the quiet thud of her footsteps across the kitchen floor. It made the work feel lighter, almost cheerful. Anyone who walked through the house felt the shift in mood immediately. It was impossible not to smile when the music floated past. Maple cream candies were the kind of Christmas treat that felt almost too delicate to touch, the sort of candy you picked up with 2 fingers because you were afraid of ruining its perfect little shape. Back when holiday molds were pulled out only once a year, families would make batch after batch of these maple-scented treasures, pouring warm maple cream into tiny molds shaped like angels, bells, trees, or snowflakes. There was nothing artificial about them, nothing rushed or store-bought. Just pure maple syrup cooked slowly with butter and a little cream until it thickened enough to take form. Older cooks knew exactly when to remove the pot from the heat because the scent changed slightly and the bubbles grew heavier. Children would hover close by, praying aloud that someone would let them scrape the sides of the pot once the molds were filled. When the candies cooled, they popped out smooth and pale, each one melting the moment it touched your tongue. The taste was rich but somehow light, like maple sugar dissolved into snow. These candies were often packed into little tins and given to teachers, neighbors, or grandparents, each tin tied with ribbon and smelling faintly like winter cabins and warm kitchens. People do not make maple cream candies as often today because real maple syrup is expensive and patience is in shorter supply than ever. But older generations still talk about them as the candy that made Christmas feel elegant, homemade, and full of intention. They were the kind of treat that asked you to slow down, breathe in the moment, and savor a sweetness that came entirely from nature. They tasted like the quiet side of Christmas, the part that lived in small traditions and thoughtful hands. Blancmange molded in copper forms graced Victorian Christmas tables with its pristine beauty. This milk pudding, thickened with cornstarch or Irish moss and flavored with almond extract, emerged from molds in elaborate shapes that showcased the cook's artistry. The texture was silky smooth, trembling gently when carried to the table on silver platters. Families served it with fruit sauces, raspberry, strawberry, or preserved cherries, that provided color contrast and flavor counterpoint. Making proper blancmange required attention to temperature and timing, the mixture needing precise cooking to set without becoming rubbery. Some cooks added ground almonds for authenticity. Others relied on extract alone for convenience. Children loved its mild sweetness and wobbly presentation, while adults appreciated its refined simplicity. The copper molds themselves were prized possessions, passed through generations and displayed in kitchen hutches. Blancmange faded as instant puddings promised convenience, sacrificing elegance for speed. Serving ambrosia salad as a fancy side was one of the little ways Grandma added sparkle to Thanksgiving, even when the ingredients were simple. She mixed the citrus, coconut, and pastel marshmallows as if she were preparing a centerpiece, stirring everything gently until it looked almost too pretty to touch. Back then, ambrosia salad felt like sophistication, a sweet moment in the middle of a heavy meal. Kids loved the colors. Adults loved the cool, creamy break from richer dishes, and Grandma loved that it made the table look complete. She always chilled it for hours, so every bite was soft and refreshing. When she placed it on the table, the meal instantly felt like a celebration. It was her quiet nod to glamour, even if she never called it that. To her, it was a holiday dish that showed she had gone the extra step. Tastes may have changed over the years, but her ambrosia salad stayed legendary because it carried effort, care, and joy. It was part of what made Thanksgiving perfect. Ham bone soup became Christmas dinner when the bone itself was the only gift families could afford, the remnant of someone else's feast transformed into a meal for those with less. Churches and wealthier neighbors sometimes donated ham bones after their own celebrations, and grateful recipients knew exactly how to honor such gifts. The bone went into the largest pot with dried beans that had been soaking overnight, along with onions, carrots, and potatoes from the root cellar. Hours of simmering coaxed every bit of smoky flavor from the bone, while beans softened into creamy submission. The soup thickened as starches released, becoming more stew than broth by the time it reached the table. Families ladled generous portions into bowls, knowing this single bone would feed everyone for days. Ham bone soup represented community and generosity, the understanding that sharing meant everyone could celebrate. Popcorn balls with molasses syrup were the sticky, unforgettable treats that defined Christmas in homes where money was tight but joy was strong. Fresh popcorn filled the biggest bowl in the kitchen, and molasses syrup simmered until it smelled deep and warm. Adults poured the hot syrup over the popcorn and stirred with wooden spoons. Once it cooled slightly, everyone buttered their hands and shaped the mixture into balls, laughing at the mess. Some came out round, others lopsided, but all tasted like comfort. Wrapped in wax paper, they were given to neighbors or packed for school. Popcorn balls disappeared over time because molasses lost popularity, but anyone who remembers them knows how special they were. They tasted like togetherness you could hold in your hands. Nesselrode pudding brought Russian elegance to American Christmas tables during the Gilded Age. This frozen dessert combined chestnut puree with candied fruits, maraschino cherries, and whipped cream, all enriched with egg custard and a generous pour of maraschino liqueur. The mixture was frozen in decorative molds, then unmolded to reveal elaborate shapes that gleamed on silver platters. Named for a Russian diplomat, the pudding represented cosmopolitan sophistication that wealthy families aspired to display. The chestnut flavor was unlike anything else on the holiday table, earthy and sweet in equal measure. Making it required sourcing chestnuts, candying fruits, and mastering the temperamental frozen custard technique. Families served thin slices, the richness demanding restraint. The pudding disappeared as its ingredients became exotic and its preparation too demanding for modern schedules. Nesselrode pudding was Christmas elegance frozen into unforgettable form. Hummingbird cake was once a Thanksgiving showstopper, a towering southern dessert packed with banana, pineapple, and toasted nuts that made the whole room go quiet with the first slice. It tasted like sunshine and warmth even on the coldest holiday morning. Families made it because it felt generous, full of ingredients you saved for special occasions. The batter was thick and fragrant, spiced just enough to feel festive, and the cream cheese frosting wrapped everything in a soft, tangy sweetness. Every layer tasted like celebration. For years, it stood proudly among pies on Thanksgiving buffets, especially in the Deep South, where hospitality meant feeding people with your best over time, though, it slipped into birthday parties and spring gatherings instead, pushed aside by pumpkin pies and chocolate desserts that dominated holiday tables. But those who grew up with hummingbird cake remember the joy of cutting into it, the way the fruit kept it moist for days, and how it felt like the dessert that understood the holiday best, abundant, warm, and made to share. A sweet memory worth keeping alive. Putting walnuts in the stuffing was one of Grandma's little signatures, a small detail that turned her dish into something unmistakably hers. She would crush the walnuts by hand, just enough to give them texture without overpowering the rest of the ingredients. Then she folded them into the mixture with an ease that came from years of perfecting her craft. The moment that stuffing hit the oven, the warm, nutty smell drifted through the house, subtle but unforgettable. At the table, the walnuts added a quiet crunch that surprised people who forgot she always used them. They blended perfectly with the sage, broth, and cornbread, adding depth no boxed version could match. That handful of walnuts was more than just flavor. It was Grandma's way of marking the dish as her own, a reminder that even the smallest choices could carry a piece of memory. Neck bones and rice stretched across Christmas tables in homes where ham was a luxury and turkey was a dream. The bony cuts simmered until their meat fell apart into savory shreds. Pork neck bones cost almost nothing because butchers considered them more bone than meat, but families knew better. Hours of simmering extracted every bit of flavor, the bones releasing gelatin that thickened the cooking liquid into rich gravy. The meat, though sparse, was deeply flavored and satisfying when spooned over mounds of rice that absorbed the pork-infused liquid. Some families added onions and garlic, others kept it simple with just salt and pepper. The dish required no special skills, only patience and a heavy pot that could withstand hours on the stove. Children learned to pick around bones, finding every tender morsel hidden in the joints. Neck bones and rice represented survival cooking at its most practical, turning what others discarded into Christmas dinner. Cranberry pudding with hard sauce was one of those desserts that looked humble on the outside, but carried a surprising punch once you cut into it. This steamed pudding was dense, tart, and beautifully old-fashioned, the kind of dish families made before ovens were common in every home. The cranberries gave it a deep ruby color and a sharpness that cut through the heaviness of a Thanksgiving meal, and it always arrived at the table warm enough to fog up the windows. But the real magic came from the hard sauce, a thick mixture of butter, sugar, and a touch of something strong enough to make everyone at the table raise their eyebrows just a bit. When you dolloped it over the pudding, it melted slowly, seeping into every corner and creating a flavor no modern dessert can truly imitate. Families made this because it felt festive, grown up, and cozy all at once, a dessert that lit up the room even without frosting or decorations. Over time, the steaming process fell out of fashion, and people traded long cooking times for convenience. Microwaves replaced kettles, boxed mixes replaced handwritten recipes, and the pudding slipped quietly into obscurity. But the truth is, a dessert like this was never about convenience. It was about gathering in the kitchen, checking the pot, waiting together, and finally sharing something warm and indulgent on a cold holiday night, a forgotten classic, but one with a heart that has never really disappeared. Snow pudding with custard sauce brought elegance to Victorian Christmas tables with its cloud-like texture and golden accompaniment. The pudding was made from gelatin, sugar, lemon juice, and stiffly beaten egg whites, creating something ethereal and trembling. It arrived at the table pure white and shimmering, often molded into decorative shapes that showcased the cook's skill. The custard sauce, rich with egg yolks and vanilla, provided warmth and richness against the cold, airy pudding. This combination of textures, soft, cold, light against warm, smooth, rich, made every spoonful a revelation. Families considered it sophisticated enough for company, yet simple enough for Christmas Eve supper. The dessert required careful timing, the gelatin needing to set properly before unmolding. Children adored the wobbling presentation, while adults appreciated the delicate balance of flavors. Snow pudding vanished as instant desserts replaced homemade gelatin creations, taking its quiet elegance with it. Blessing the food before eating was one of those grounding traditions Grandma held on to no matter how life changed. Everyone gathered around the table, hands linked or heads bowed, and she spoke with a calm voice that settled the room. Her words were simple but heartfelt, touching on gratitude, family, and the hope that everyone would be safe and cared for in the coming year. The moment always brought a hush, reminding people of what the day was truly about. It was a pause that made the meal feel sacred. And even the youngest family members sensed its importance, watching her with quiet attention, understanding that this was the heartbeat of the holiday. City chicken appeared on Christmas tables across working-class neighborhoods where actual poultry remained a distant dream, cubes of cheap pork threaded onto wooden skewers to mimic drumsticks. Butchers sold pork scraps for pennies, and clever cooks transformed these humble cuts into something festive by breading and frying the assembled skewers until golden. The name was pure aspiration. There was no chicken involved, just the wish for something fancier than what the budget allowed. Each skewer was rolled in flour, dipped in egg, then coated in breadcrumbs before frying in hot lard. The finished pieces looked almost elegant, their stick handles suggesting drumsticks that could be eaten with fingers. Mothers presented them proudly on Christmas platters, the illusion complete enough that children felt they were eating something special. City chicken cost a fraction of real poultry, yet delivered the same crispy-coated satisfaction. Pecan log rolls were the kind of Christmas candy that made children stare wide-eyed at every slice. They began with a soft nougat or marshmallow center, something sweet and pillowy. Then warm caramel wrapped around it until the whole thing glowed golden. Chopped pecans waited on a board, and rolling the caramel-covered log across them was the best part, covering every inch in crunchy nuts. The mix of soft center, chewy caramel, and crisp pecans made each bite feel like 3 candies in one. Families made them in big batches, wrapping them in wax paper and storing them in tins. Making them was messy, loud, and fun. Store-bought versions exist now, but homemade rolls tasted fresher and warmer, filled with real holiday effort. They were more than candy. They were tradition shaped by hand. Butterscotch pie was the kind of dessert that made people stop mid-conversation when it was carried to the table, its glossy meringue peaks and golden filling catching the light in a way no one could ignore. The magic started on the stovetop, where sugar and butter melted together to create a deep caramel flavor that filled the kitchen with warmth. Once the mixture thickened into a silky custard, it was poured into a flaky crust and crowned with a cloud of meringue. Families loved it because it felt luxurious without being expensive, a dessert that tasted like a special occasion even on ordinary days. During the holidays, butterscotch pie was always one of the first things to disappear, with children fighting over the corner slices where the meringue browned just a little more. But as boxed pudding mixes and frozen pies became household staples, this stovetop masterpiece faded out. No one wanted to stand over a pot stirring carefully, watching for that perfect moment when the custard thickened. The world got busier, and the pie slipped quietly into memory. Yet anyone who tasted it fresh will tell you that nothing made with shortcuts ever came close, a lost masterpiece of sweetness and tradition. Making her own pie crust was one of the clearest signs that Grandma believed the foundation of a dessert mattered as much as the filling. While others leaned on store-bought shortcuts, she reached for flour, butter, salt, and cold water with the confidence of someone who had done it thousands of times. She pressed, folded, and rolled the dough until it reached that perfect balance between tender and sturdy. She never rushed. She chilled the dough when it needed resting and softened it when it needed warmth, and the result was unmistakable. Her crust flaked in soft layers that melted on the fork, cracking gently under the knife in a sound everyone recognized. People pretended to focus on the filling, but the truth was they came for the crust. It tasted like tradition and skill learned long before anyone else at the table was born. Every pie carried her signature, from the golden sheen to the crimped edge shaped by her fingertips. Store-bought crusts never stood a chance. She never bragged, because to her this was simply the right way to do it. Her pies were unforgettable because she was baked into every slice. Poor man's fruitcake appeared at Christmas when the traditional version's expensive ingredients were beyond reach, substituting whatever dried fruits and nuts the pantry held. Real fruitcake required candied citrus, exotic spices, and aged spirits that working families couldn't afford. The poor man's version used raisins, dried apples, and whatever nuts could be gathered from nearby trees, bound with molasses instead of sugar. The batter was dense and dark, baked slowly until a knife came out clean, then wrapped in cloth to age until Christmas morning. Though lacking candied cherries and imported almonds, this humble cake delivered the same comforting density and spiced sweetness that defined holiday baking. Families sliced it thin, making each loaf last through the season. Poor man's fruitcake represented adaptation, the willingness to participate in tradition even when resources demanded substitution. The taste was different, but the meaning remained. Which Depression-era Christmas meal would you bring back to your holiday table? Share your family's survival recipes in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten foods that fed America through its hardest times.